Hi, I want to thank everyone for taking the time today to join a HIAS conference call and to warmly welcome you to what is actually HIAS's first public video conference. In the past, we have held 4 to 6 briefing calls per year, and we're excited to be able to bring some new technology into the way that we're communicating with the people who've been supporting and following our work. 1 year ago, we started to see leaks that as one of the very first acts of their government, the Trump administration was going to institute a Muslim ban and a refugee ban. On January 27, 2017, which was Holocaust Remembrance Day, at 4:30 p.m., just minutes before Shabbat, this extraordinary act happened, and I don't think that any of us are likely to quickly forget our feelings of betrayal, of anger, of deep concern for the refugees that we work with, and later of hope when so many people showed up in the streets and at the airports to protest. So it felt fitting to acknowledge the anniversary of that moment, to look back on the very many turns and twists that were the past year, and to assess where we are now and where we're going in 2018. And we're so glad that you could join us for this call. On the call, you'll hear from 4 of us. If you're joining by computer, you should be able to see us on your screen. In our Silver Spring office, we have our senior leadership, Mark Hetfield, President and CEO of HIAS, and Melanie Nezer, Senior Vice President of Public Affairs. In the New York office, we have Jana Diamond, Campaign Specialist, and I am Rebecca Kersner, and I'm the Director of Campaigns here at HIAS. And Jana and I are both on a team which engages the Jewish community to take action for refugees. I will shortly turn over the call to Melanie, who will give a status update, where things stand for refugees and the refugee program. Following Melanie, Mark will talk about how HIAS has stepped up to this moment this past year and what our response will look like moving forward. And then following Mark, I will talk through some of the ways that all of you on the call can help. Throughout the call, we encourage you to submit questions. Again, if you're joining us by computer, you can do that through the question and answer bar on your screen. And if you're joining us by phone, you can submit questions by writing to info@hias.org. So now I'll turn it over to Melanie Nezer in Silver Spring.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining us. I've been asked to kind of give a recap over the last year and what we've been through and where that takes us to today. So I'm going to do that pretty quickly in a pretty broad strokes. And if you have specific questions that I don't cover, feel free to ask them at the end of the presentation. As Rebecca said, about a year ago, or just about exactly a year ago, President Trump did sign the first executive order barring Muslims and refugees from coming to the United States. And in the last year, that executive order and some subsequent orders that he signed have been making their way through the courts. Almost immediately after the executive order was signed, HIAS made a decision to challenge those orders in court. And we have been doing that all year. It's been a lot of twists and turns. We've had some very significant victories throughout the year. And ultimately, I can report that although we did not see the number of refugees that we had been expecting before the election, and that number actually had been set at 110,000 refugees for the year, mind you, in a context where we have more refugees in the world than at any other time since World War II, we did see more than 53,000 refugees admitted last year, and that was because of the aggressive litigation stance that HIAS and our partners took, challenging those orders. So it was a difficult year. I'm just talking now strictly in terms of the executive order and the impact it's had on the refugee program. This is no way to run a program, no matter what your political views are, whether you support refugee resettlement or not. Every day, the system was different. So for those of us who work in the refugee resettlement field and work directly with refugees, it was very difficult to navigate and to kind of run these programs, to know who was able to come, who wasn't able to come. It changed, it felt like, on a daily basis. What do we tell our clients about when their family members could arrive or what hope they had for the future? It was a tumultuous year, but I think I can speak, I can say that for all of us that we have no regrets for taking such a strong stance in the courts, standing up against these illegal executive orders that sought to ban people based on their country of origin or their religion. So that takes us through, that was basically the executive orders were signed starting a year ago. There were a couple of subsequent orders that were signed. We did have, like I said, some victories in court. The refugee program remained open, although at a much slower pace. And the refugee admissions really remain very low right now. So although last year we did get 53,000 refugees coming into this country, that's not going to happen this year. This is the first full year, fiscal year of the Trump administration, and the Trump administration set the refugee admissions number at 45,000 this year, which is a historic low. So, so there's no way we're going to get above that, and in fact, it's likely we're not even going to get anywhere near that. Right now, where we are at the first quarter of this fiscal year, which ended at the end of December, about 5,000 refugees have been admitted. So at that pace, if you do the math, we're looking at about 20,000 refugees for the year. Now, this is not going to necessarily remain stagnant over the entire year, and there are many years where refugee admissions accelerate towards the end of the year, but it's hard to envision, us getting close to 45,000 refugees unless we really put a lot of pressure on, and Mark's going to talk about that. I also want to say, in terms of Syrian refugees, and I know many of you are concerned about resettlement and protection for Syrian refugees in particular. In 2016, the U.S. resettled over 10,000 Syrian refugees. In this fiscal year so far, we've resettled 33 people. So that's a really marked shift for our policies. I'll also say, in terms of percentages, although the numbers are down for everybody, so refugees of all religions are coming in much lower numbers, the percentage of Muslim refugees that are coming in went to 45% last year to about 10% this year. So that's a big change as well. The most recent executive order wasn't actually an executive order that maybe you saw about in the news like you had the previous ones. It was more of a policy proclamation, and it's had a real impact on refugee resettlement. That was signed on October 24th. It expired just a few days ago. And what it did is it kept people from 11 countries from entering the US at all as refugees for 3 months. And that included refugees from Syria, Somalia, and Iraq, which made up the largest numbers of refugees that had been coming in. Although that has expired and is officially over, you still have, we're still in a situation where we have, many new security checks, which not only, it's not just that refugees aren't going to be able to get through them, it's going to be difficult for government officials to even process people, get people through the security process. So that's going to really slow down the process even more. Very few interviews of refugees abroad. As most of you know, every refugee is personally interviewed by a government official before they can come to the US. So if we don't send out those government officials to do those interviews, refugees aren't going to come. So this has been, obviously a huge year for our program, full of a lot of challenges. We're also worried about funding for refugees overseas. Most refugees are not going to be resettled, and they need our support in countries that they fled to. 85% of refugees are in developing countries, and the level of funding that the international community, including the US, is providing those countries to support them is really low. So, we're not helping them here, we're not helping them there. We're basically abandoning our commitment to refugees. And I also, before turning it over to Mark, just want to note that the way this plays out in the real world is that our refugee program is by invitation only. This is a very controlled process, and we decide, our government decides who can come in. So a refugee who has been invited to apply to this program, who has submitted, all the documentation that's required, all of the medical checks, has told their stories of persecution multiple times to multiple strangers, has had their irises scanned in some cases, definitely has had their fingerprints taken multiple times, has gone through all kinds of security screening, because we asked them to do that at a chance to come to the United States. And what we've done to those people is basically just slam the door in their faces. So the implications of that worldwide to our reputation as a country that has values that are humanitarian and that are fair and just, really puts that at risk. So I would just say at this point, it's been a really tough year, but it's also been a very inspiring year. People have come out in droves to support refugees, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Jewish community in particular has really made its voice heard. We have a lot of momentum going into 2018 despite all the challenges that we're facing. So Mark, you want to talk about what HIAS is doing and what the Jewish community is doing?
Sure, thanks Melanie. I've been with HIAS for a long time. I first joined in 1989, and at that time HIAS focused almost entirely on helping refugees because they were Jewish. And since then, as you know, we've undergone a transformation, and now we help refugees because we are Jewish. And I've seen a lot of change over the last 30 years in this agency, but no changes as dramatic and abrupt as the ones that we've seen just over the last 2 years. In 2016, 2015, 2016, the world finally woke up to the global refugee crisis. The American Jewish community finally woke up to the global refugee crisis. So did the Obama White House, and we had a reason to feel encouraged. That finally someone was going to do something, that finally our community, the United States, was going to do something to address the crisis that refugees were facing around the globe. And so in 2016, HIAS resettled 4,191 refugees. But then last year, in 2017, we resettled only 3,299. And it would have been far less had it not been for the aggressive aggressive actions that Melanie referred to that HIAS took. So this all started when we had to change our course after the election. We were concerned that Donald Trump would make good on his campaign promise to ban Muslims from the United States, that he would make good on his campaign promise to ban many refugees from the United States. And sure enough, that's what happened. So what did we do? We did, of course, file a lawsuit, as Melanie referred to, and we have litigated this case over and over again. First, we did it ourselves in Maryland, and then our partner agencies, the Jewish Family Service of Seattle and Jewish Family Services of Silicon Valley, continued to litigate the case in Seattle successfully in December. And this was largely responsible for keeping the doors of the refugee program open. We've also been successful in engaging our community and engaging the American Jewish community to show that this issue is very important to us as a community, that we knew what it was like to be refugees ourselves, and that we're going to stand up for others now that we're in a position to do so. So we took to the streets. We had over 2,200 rabbis sign on to our statement demanding that the United States keep its doors open to refugees. We have 380 congregations that have signed on to our refugee welcome campaign. And we had over 60 events over the course of last year, 60 demonstrations, 60 public events to express our concern about what America was becoming, to express our concern about the need to keep our doors open to refugees. But that's not enough. We are losing this battle. In fact, we keep winning different battles in court, we keep winning battles in the streets, but the bottom line is that, as you'll see in a few minutes, and as Melanie already discussed, this country is becoming less and less welcoming to refugees only because of US government policy, not because we're not a welcoming people. And we have to continue to confront that. I get concerned that some of us are getting tired. We need to re-energize and remember that if we don't say anything, we are going to lose this. And last time we lost this in 1921, the doors stayed shut for 44 years. We have to make sure that we do not let that happen. And HIAS is doing its best to make sure that it doesn't happen. And I just came back myself from a trip overseas where I saw the impact that the security vetting, the so-called security vetting, is having on refugees. This is a system that is calibrated totally wrongly, where common sense has no application. I saw one refugee who has been deemed to be a security risk to the United States. That person was in a wheelchair, is mentally developed at about the level of a 5-year-old, but somehow the United States government has said that he represents a security threat to the United States, and because of that, he and his family are not allowed to come here. It just doesn't make any sense, but this is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a systematic effort to keep refugees out of this country under the pretense of security. It's keeping families apart, it's keeping refugees in danger, and it's making us look like something that we're not. We are a welcoming country. The American Jewish community wants to welcome refugees, and HIAS needs your help to continue to do that. Thank you. And now I want to pass it to Rebecca Kersner to talk about what you can do.
So both Mark and Melanie mentioned that over the course of the past year, there's the silver lining, the thing that kept us all going and kept us buoyed was actually support from the Jewish community and the level of interest and the level of activism that was happening. And so firstly, we really want to thank you, anyone who's on the call who was part of that. It did make a tremendous difference. As Mark said, we won more times than maybe we imagined that we would, and pushing is what is going to continue to make a difference. There's a few ways that you can be involved. I first want to encourage you to go to the HIAS website, to hias.org/takeaction. It's a link that we'll post at the end of this call where all of these different opportunities are listed for you. The first thing is that we really do need to continue to demonstrate that this country is welcoming of refugees and that the people in this country are welcoming of refugees. We encourage you to keep showing up to rallies. If you are in New York or DC, there are major rallies this week for the anniversary of the Muslim and refugee ban, and we encourage you to go to those too. But even to any other actions that are happening in your area, we have signs and banners on our website that you can print and bring with you to show that you support Welcome for Refugees. We need to continue to demonstrate that this matters. We need to keep that issue on the front burner, even when it falls off in terms of the headlines. Number two is we really need your help in being in contact with your elected officials. Whether your member of Congress tends to be more supportive of the refugee program or whether they tend to not, it's so important that they hear from us, from all of us, their constituents, that we care about this issue. We have tools on our website for you to be able to call your member of Congress, for you to be able to email, and even to set up meetings with your member of Congress, and we really encourage you to do that. They only want to hear from their constituents, so so if everyone on this call were able to do that, you would be able to amplify our message so much more. We also encourage you, as the elections start to heat up in each of the different areas that you live, to be in contact with people who are running for office to express your support for refugees and to make sure that they're aware that their constituency cares about this issue. On our website, there's a few other ways that you can get involved, including volunteering in your local area, including getting your community involved. For example, we have a welcome campaign, which is a synagogue action network with nearly 400 congregations that are taking action, and we encourage you to consider whether you can add your synagogue to that list. But I want to say, most importantly, this issue is both an urgent issue, a devastatingly urgent issue for the lives of the people that need to find safety, and it is a long game. So even more than just taking one action today, we encourage you to sign up for our listserv, to sign on to our Jews for Refugees Facebook group so that you can be involved, so that you can be informed, and so you can be signed on for the long term. This is something that is not going away, and we do really encourage you to, to both to take action now and to continue to look for ways that's sustainable for you to be involved in this moving forward. We have gotten throughout the call a number of questions that have come in both through the Q&A on the computer and through the info@hias.org. Please continue to submit them. But for right now, I'm going to turn it over to Jana to read off some of the questions that we're hearing, and they'll be answered both from our office here and from Mark and Melanie in Silver Spring.
Great. So I just want to say one more time, please continue to submit your questions either by the Q&A toolbar, the button in your toolbar, or through info@hias.org. We have gotten a few in that are particular to specific locations, which we will absolutely follow up with you about after the call. So I'm going to go ahead and address the first, actually a number of questions that have come in about which refugees are coming in now and where are they from?
I can take that one. So, you know, prior to the ban last year, or I guess now it's 2016, the majority of refugees were coming in from Muslim countries like Iraq, Syria, and Somalia. And I do want to actually clear this up because there's some confusion around this. They actually, and I just said it the wrong way, they're actually not coming from those countries. That's their country of origin. But we're not resettling Syrian refugees from Syria. To be a refugee, you will have to cross an international border. And most of them have been in another country for 4 or 5 years, in the case of Syrians. In the case of Somalis, generations. So just as an aside, when people question the security of the program, we're actually cooperating with governments that are allies of ours that have actually hosted these refugees for many years in doing security checks. But that's an aside. But those are the countries that that we had made long-standing commitments to in some cases, and in some cases much newer commitments, like to resettle Syrians, to bring them in. This year, those populations are not coming. Like I said, there's a handful of Syrians that have come in this fiscal year, which started on October 1st. And there's also many fewer refugees coming in. So some of the smaller populations that we've been resettling are now the largest, even though in numbers they may not have increased. One population that really has increased that I think we'll see a lot more resettlement of is Congolese refugees that are being resettled out of countries in the region, Uganda, Rwanda, maybe Burundi as well. Those populations, Congolese are not subject to increased security checks. There are certain countries that are, mostly Muslim countries, and certain countries that are not. So Congolese are now at the top of the list, even though it's a relatively small number that have come in, as well as Burmese and Bhutanese, which was a large population that we were resettling, but that had been winding down. So not countries that you really think of right now when you think of the global refugee crisis. And I want to explain that actually the Burmese refugees that are coming in are not the Rohingya refugees that have fled to Bangladesh. These are Burmese religious and ethnic minorities that fled, many, many years ago that are still coming in. So, but I do want to say, even though I'm saying these are the largest populations, they're still very small. We're talking about a few thousand from each of these countries.
Great, thank you. Next question coming in, we actually have a few on this through email and our Q&A box. How is HIAS supporting DACA?
So, we're very focused here on this call on refugee and asylum issues. Actually, on this one, mostly refugee issues, but HIAS is focused on refugee protection. But we don't live in a bubble, and we live in an ecosystem where we also support fair and humane treatment and justice for all immigrants. So certainly the expiration or the forced expiration of DACA is something that has greatly concerned us. And we have been involved in sponsoring events, signing on to letters, writing op-eds, and taking other action in support of a Clean Dream Act. So that is something we strongly encourage. We work very closely in coalition with a broad range of faith groups and immigrants' rights groups and other civil rights and social justice groups that this is a national priority. And we do see refugee protection as part of that you know, the kind of the quilt of all of the different policies that make up a just and humane immigration system. So definitely we've been on record on DACA, also on the expiration of TPS. We're very concerned about Salvadorans, Haitians, and others that are looking at termination of their legal status in the short term. All of these things concern us and are very linked to our mission.
Great, thank you. So the next one here we're going to address is so there was some talk about refugees coming in that are from a specific group. Can you speak to if refugees are coming in as SIVs or who is coming in right now? It was a
I think the question that there's a little glitch there was about special immigrant visas. Yeah, so special immigrant visas are visas that are issued to Iraqis and Afghans who worked with the US forces during the conflicts there, either as translators or in other ways. We had made a commitment to many thousands of those people that we would protect them and bring them to the US. We continue, I mean, we are not nearly admitting that there's a lot of concern that there are people that have been left exposed and in danger in those countries, but we do continue to process SIV visas. These are not, they're not technically refugees, but they're treated much like refugees in terms of the reception that they get in this country. But they do continue to come. Many Iraqis are going to Southern California and Northern Virginia. I'm not sure really with the Afghans where they're exactly going, but they do continue to come. But again, the whole process has gotten slower for everybody who's being admitted.
Although we do understand that for the first time ever, even though the quota for refugees, the ceiling for refugees is 45,000, and there's expected to be 15,000 SIVs coming in, so far this year we've had more SIVs enter the country than refugees.
Great. The next one here is the US policy on refugees inextricably tied to politics? How do we prevent refugees from being political victims in our partisan fight?
Yeah, one of the things that used to be good about the refugee program is it was a bipartisan program, and it had Republican support as well as Democratic support. And this changed dramatically, I would say almost overnight, really in 2015, when the world refugee crisis started getting attention in this country. And I would say that the real most monumental moment was on November 13th, 2015, after the attacks in Paris. And American politicians, in particular 31 governors and all 14 at that time Republican presidential candidates, decided that they would make Americans feel safer by saying they will ban Syrian Muslims from coming to the United States to make sure this does not become like Paris. Yet, this was a very strange reaction because there were no Syrians that were involved in any way, as far as we know, in those attacks in Paris. But nonetheless, this was the response. And that really marked the extreme politicization of the refugee program, where you had the Republican candidates saying that, and then the 3 Democratic candidates at that time saying, not only should we continue to allow Syrian refugees in, but we should allow far more in. And all 3 of them, just 2 days after the attack, said we should allow 65,000 more Syrian refugees in than we have been. And that marked really the beginning of a political battle, which has not yet abated. And with the Trump presidency, it has certainly carried on. And this is very much being done for political reasons. This is the politics of fear that President Trump ran on and is now running the country on, to make us feel safe by keeping refugees out of the country. Notwithstanding that refugees are not bringing danger, they're fleeing it.
And I'll just to add to that, because I was thinking about this earlier today, there are refugee resettlement program is almost completely in the purview of the president. This is a program the president decides in consultation with Congress, which can happen to a greater or lesser degree, in consultation with the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security, which also, historically, those agencies have had more influence than they do now. But each president really has put his mark or spin or approach on the refugee program. President Reagan admitted more refugees than any other president. He was motivated by, he made this famous speech of the shining city on the hill. Of course, he was motivated by, fighting communism and protecting victims of communism. So every president, his worldview has been reflected in the refugee program. And we can see what this president's worldview is. And that is reflected, it's a value, and it's reflected through the implementation of this program. And it's conveyed out to the rest of the world through this program. So is it political? Of course it's political. And that can be good and that can be bad. And right now it's just particularly dangerous.
Great. I'm going to divert a little bit here. We're going to go to, is there a specific action? Now we're going into congregational help and the ways to take action. Is there a specific action that congregations can take to support displaced people abroad?
So I'll take that one.
Great.
I would really encourage anyone who's a member of a synagogue to take a look at the HIAS Welcome Campaign page and find out if your congregation is already a member of the HIAS Welcome Campaign. It actually has been a pretty remarkable thing to watch over the course of the past year. Almost 300 congregations have joined the Welcome Campaign just in the past year alone. And those congregations are taking action through a range of ways that varies between heavy amounts of advocacy to doing public actions and rallies, to actually supporting the resettlement of refugees in their own communities, to raising money in tzedakah projects, to educational programs and things that raise awareness within their community. And it's actually pretty remarkable to see the range and to see how many congregations across the country are doing it. I would definitely look and see if your congregation is part of that, and encourage them to be part of it. We actually support the Welcome Campaign Network very extensively from our office here in New York. So if your congregation is interested in being involved, we're happy to have a conversation and to work with you and figure out what the right next steps are. And certainly any one of those actions is extremely helpful and adds to our ability to serve refugees as a whole.
Thank you, Rebecca. Another one that came in via email is around the African asylum seekers in Israel. So does HIAS have a position about the Sudanese and Eritrean refugees who are going to be deported?
HIAS has long had a position on this. We feel that while Israel is a light unto the nations in many ways, one of them has not been its treatment of asylum seekers. First and foremost, they are asylum seekers. Israel has 40,000 Eritreans and Sudanese and South Sudanese who are in Israel, having fled there mainly by way of Egypt to find protection and safety. And the government has made it very, very difficult for them to find those things. They have put them under a great deal of pressure to self-deport. The government has pursued policies of detention to try to pressure them to leave the country. They are withholding money from their wages, which they can only collect upon departure from the country. So the government is applying a lot of policies to make it unpleasant and difficult for the asylum seekers to stay there. We have been advocating very vigorously for Israel to accept its responsibility for these asylum seekers, to allow them to get refuge until it is safe to return home, and to make a living and have rights like everybody else in the meantime. We are starting to finally make some progress in the last couple of weeks. As many of you know, There has been a great deal of pressure from Israeli society to encourage the government to do the right thing. You may have heard that El Al pilots said that they will not carry these asylum seekers to Rwanda or Uganda against their will. They will not participate in their deportations. Many Holocaust survivors have said that they will hide these refugees in their homes so they do not get deported or sent to those countries or picked up for detention. Many rabbis have actually stood up and spoken out for the refugees, as have many, many intellectuals and just regular people in Israel. So we're really seeing the best and the worst here of Israeli society and Israeli politics in terms of the response. HIAS has been very outspoken. You may have seen that we did recently sign a letter to the Prime Minister, an open letter with the Anti-Defamation League about this issue. We are part of the Let Us Help campaign with many, many other American Jewish organizations that have said to the Israeli government, we would like to help you work with these asylum seekers so that they can find safety and support themselves until it's safe to go back home. So yes, we're very, very engaged in this. One program we actually run in particular is we run a program we call the Rukin Fellows Program in Tel Aviv, where we mentor lawyers, mentor young lawyers, and help them learn how to represent asylum seekers in legal proceedings. And so we now have around 100 alumni of this program who have taken on cases to help asylum seekers assert their rights, and they have been quite successful. One of the shining aspects of Israel is the court system, and we generally find that when asylum seekers resort to the courts, they do get the protection that they need. So we're really hoping that Israeli policy toward these asylum seekers turns around, and that once again, Israel is a light unto the nation in terms of the way it treats people who need refuge, because it is, like the United States, a country that was really founded by refugees.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to connect two different questions together now. Can you comment on the impact of refugee resettlement in states that have opted out, as well as the current state, as our government is prepared to pass a budget and to compromise on immigration? Will that include refugees? So I just pulled from two different pieces, state refugee resettlement and the budget.
Sure, I'm sure both of us have plenty to say on that. One is in terms of the states opting out. As I mentioned, back in 2015, 31 governors said they were going to close their doors to Syrian Muslim refugees. Now, of course, they cannot close their doors to Syrian Muslim refugees or to any kind of a refugee. That is a federal decision. Unfortunately, Donald Trump is trying to close our doors to that population, but a governor does not have that authority. But they do have some authority, and only a handful of those 31 have exercised that authority. A number of them have declared they are withdrawing from the U.S. refugee admissions program, and which basically means they're no longer going to accept money from the federal government to resettle refugees. That does not deter the federal government from putting refugees in their states. It just means that other agencies, private agencies, will get the funding to serve refugees that would have otherwise gone to the state government. This has happened so far in Texas, where Governor Abbott withdrew from the refugee program over the objection of 75 rabbis, among many, many other people. That's unfortunate because Texas is the largest resettlement state in the country, even larger than California, but nonetheless, refugee resettlement continued and continues in Texas after the governor withdrew. Likewise, the governor of Maine withdrew from the refugee program. And again, resettlement continues to Maine, just through private agencies rather than through the state. Governor Brownback from Kansas withdrew from the refugee program. Refugees continue to get resettled in Kansas. And Governor Christie, who is no longer the governor of New Jersey, also withdrew from the refugee program, which again was simply privatized by the federal government. So it's very unfortunate that state governors have done this. Fortunately, only a handful have actually carried through with their threat to pull out of the refugee program, but refugee resettlement will go on in those states with the support of private communities. In terms of your second question, do you want to?
Sure. And just to add to that, you know, it underscores this whole point that this is no way to run a refugee program, regardless of how you feel about it, because if you care at all about fiscal responsibility, it's just a waste of money to transfer responsibility from the state to a private entity to administer a program that's going to happen in your state anyway. And in fact, brings a fair amount of federal dollars to the state. So, you know, it's just to score a political point based on, you know, sowing fear and xenophobia. You know, it actually has a financial cost, that money that could be used for so many other more important things. But that aside, in terms of the broader budget debate, you know, it's hard to see where this is going. You know, we may have another government shutdown. The underlying bills that supposedly Congress is supposed to fund the government through for fiscal year 18 don't have significant cuts to refugees. Of course, with fewer coming, you know, fewer resources may be needed. Right now, it's impossible to say what this is going to look like. We do have support in Congress for refugee resettlement, and particularly for refugee assistance overseas, which is where most refugees will remain overseas, and they do need a lot more support. The U.S. is the largest single funder of the UN Refugee Agency, so you know that support has a lot of bipartisan support in Congress. So you know, not to say that it's not at risk, but we're keeping up the pressure, and we do have allies on both sides of the aisle on that. In terms of the immigration deal, there is a lot of talk, and I think you'll hear this as you hear the State of the Union address, and you see, you know, the president just released some new immigration policies. You've heard the term chain migration, which is a kind of an evil way to refer to family reunification. You're going to hear the word loopholes, which is an equally evil way to refer to asylum protection, which is in, you know, a bedrock of international and U.S. law. So you'll hear that, and yes, we're worried because there's so much pressure on some kind of a solution for the dreamers, appropriately. But what those trade-offs might be, you know, concerns us, and we need to put a lot of pressure on Congress to make sure that asylum protections aren't undermined, you know, in the face of this kind of a deal. But certainly that's a concern, and we'll be watching that very closely.
Considering those concerns, how are the low number of refugee missions affecting HIAS staff, funding, and potentially resettlement partners across the country?
I mean, clearly we've been impacted by lower number of refugees means a lower amount of funding. But our primary concern is not the funding, it's making sure that refugees actually arrive in this country. That's why we are doing this work. We want to maximize the number of refugees coming to this country, because what we've learned during this whole crisis is that our capacity, the capacity of America in general and of the American Jewish community in particular, is so much greater than was used under the Obama administration, let alone is currently being utilized under the Trump administration's restrictive policies. But that being said, yes, we are being impacted. Our affiliates, our partners who are local resettlement agencies are being impacted, but we just actually met with the executive directors of all of our local partner agencies that resettle refugees. And they uniformly feel more committed to this program than ever. They now see it as being an absolute part of their mission to keep our doors open and to keep welcoming refugees as long as we can. That being said, we have had to close a couple of sites. Los Angeles is no longer taking refugees through us. We had to close HIAS in Chicago as well. It's not closed, but it's no longer resettling refugees. So it's no longer participating in the refugee admissions program. So we are not growing as a network, we are receding a bit, but we are more committed to it than ever. Our partners are more committed to welcoming refugees than ever, and the lack of funding will not deter us.
And last question, given those low numbers that you speak of, will HIAS continue to mentor attorneys interested in pro bono work or shift attention towards asylum seekers?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. There's a backlog of around 300,000 asylum seekers, as you know, and that is, asylum seekers are seeking refuge. Asylees are refugees. There is really no legal distinction, except the asylees are here in the United States already seeking refuge, whereas the refugees are overseas trying to be resettled here. So HIAS has long trained attorneys to represent asylum seekers. We have long represented them ourselves, and this is something that we are really going to be ramping up in the years to come. This is a very important priority for us. We need to, before we can try to preach refugee protection with other countries, we have to make sure that refugees are being protected here in our own country, and HIAS is going to make sure that they are, and that they are not turned away. Asylum seekers are not trying to find a loophole, they're trying to find protection. And we're going to help them find that protection, and we're glad to have so many allies out there who are going to help us to help asylum seekers.
Great. I'll turn it back over to Rebecca. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Melanie.
I'm looking here at Jana's computer, and I can see that we were able to answer about 75% of the questions that came in. We really appreciate everyone who submitted questions, and if there are questions that you submitted that were about your particular community or your particular synagogue or city, we'll try to do our best to get back to you after this call. In a few minutes, we're also going to switch our screen over so that we can show you a video that HIAS released just yesterday. But before I do that, I want to firstly to remind you to go to the Take Action page on the HIAS website and look for ways that you can plug into our work and look for ways to continue to be involved, because this is an issue that it's not just an issue. It's not a matter of numbers. It's not a matter of policies. It's a matter of people's lives. And we are here in a position that we can take action to provide safety and to advocate for people's lives. And so we are encouraging you really to take a moment to see what you can do to step up and to be part of it. I want to say that there's no single movement, and there's no single activist cause that has ever been advanced without hope. And in the past year, where I have derived my hope from, and so many of my colleagues here, has been from all of you who have taken action in your own communities, who have gone out into the streets to advocate for the lives and for the rights and the safety and dignity of people that you have never met. And people that you will never meet, probably, who live in countries all over the world. You have given us hope, and you've also given us the ability to achieve more wins than maybe we would have anticipated, given what the current political landscape is. And so now I kind of want to turn it back to you, and maybe to give that hope back to you, and to say that this is, from where we all sit, this is we are all working on issues that even if the landscape is worse than it's been in a long time, we can see so many ways that there are to make an impact and to push back on some of these policies and to take actions that affect the lives of one person, that affect the lives of tens of thousands of people. So there is definitely that hope, and it comes from us all taking action together. And so we thank you for being on this call, and we thank you for being part of the greater HIAS community, and we hope to be in contact with you very shortly, very soon, and over the course of over the course of 2018, as we all take action together. And now we'll turn to our video now, so that you can take a look at some of the work that we've been doing.
past year, without mercy, or even a hint of empathy, Donald Trump has repeatedly attacked refugees. But it's worse than you think. On January 27, 2017, on Holocaust Remembrance Day of all days, Donald Trump banned refugees from entering the United States. In the face of the greatest global refugee crisis since World War II, Donald Trump issued an executive order dismantling our historic protection of refugees. A protection that has been the definition of America through war and peace and presidents of all persuasions. But it's worse than you think. Since the Refugee Act of 1980, the president has authorized an average of 96,000 refugees to enter the U.S. each year. Now, in a world where 1 out of every 113 people has been forced to flee their home, Donald Trump has capped refugee admissions at half that number, just 45,000. But it's much worse than you think. Added to the ban are bureaucratic slowdowns, carefully designed to limit admissions even further. So we're actually on track to welcome fewer refugees than we have in almost half a century. Even though it's harder to enter the U.S. as a refugee than any other way, Donald Trump sows fear and proclaims risk. We are at risk, but not from the refugee. We are at risk of losing what America stands for. We are at risk of becoming a country that treats human beings like numbers. The president says these bans are temporary. Well, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 was also temporary, and it shaped our immigration policy for the next 44 years. It is not only in the nature of Americans to help those denied the right to live because of their race or faith or sexual orientation. It is in the nature of the Jewish people, where the mandate to love the stranger is written in our deepest texts. So a year later, the fight goes on, in the courts and in the streets, opposing the dismantling of America's refugee program with every tool we have. We are joined by hundreds of synagogues, thousands of rabbis, and countless others, gathered in the name of the millions who seek sanctuary and safety, and a home. And in the end, it's not only about refugees, it's about who we are. Join us. It may be worse than you think, but it is not too late.